Kentucky Reaper. Dovie Branham butchered, 18. Men who kidnapped her 10-year-old son. The most savage campaign of vengeance in Appalachian history, and the most devastating demonstration that a mother's fury knows no bounds when her child has been harmed. When a woman who had spent her life slaughtering livestock turned those same skills against the 18 men who had taken her son and left him to die in the darkness of an abandoned mine. This is the true story of the Kentucky Reaper. Our story begins in the remote mountain section of Harlan County, Kentucky, in the heart of the southeastern coalfields, during the violent years of the early 20th century, when feuds and labor conflicts had made the region synonymous with bloodshed. The mountains rise here in great folds of sandstone and coal-bearing shale, their hollows sheltering families who had lived according to their own laws since before Kentucky was a state, who had never accepted the authority of a government they viewed as corrupt and distant, who maintained traditions of self-reliance and retribution that outsiders could not comprehend. You see, in Harlan County during the years of our story, violence was not an aberration, but was woven into the fabric of daily life. The feuds that had begun over politics or property or perceived insults continued through generations, each killing demanding a response that would itself demand another response, the cycle of vengeance spinning forward with a momentum that nothing seemed capable of stopping. The coal companies that had moved into the region added new forms of violence to the old, their hired guns and their Baldwin Felts detectives, treating the mountain people as obstacles to be removed rather than communities to be respected. The woman at the center of our story was known throughout the Kentucky mountains as the Reaper, though her given name was Dovie Mae Branham, and she had been born Dovie Mae Combs in 1879 in a cabin on the upper reaches of Clover Fork. She had married Ezekiel Branham when she was 16, had borne him 7 children, of whom 5 survived to adulthood, had built a life with him in the hollow where Branhams had lived for 4 generations. Her husband had died in 1910, killed in a mining accident that had taken 11 men in a single collapse, leaving her alone to raise their children and to maintain the farm that provided their livelihood. That's right. Dovie Branham was 35 years old in the autumn of 1914, a woman whose appearance suggested nothing of the violence she was capable of, whose small frame and gentle features had always seemed at odds with the hard life she lived. She stood barely 5 feet tall, had dark hair that she kept pulled back in a practical bun, had hands that were small but calloused from decades of work that would have defeated many men. Her voice was soft, her manner quiet, her reputation in the community, that of a woman who worked hard and kept to herself and caused no trouble to anyone. But Dovie Branham possessed a skill that distinguished her from other mountain women, a capability that her father had taught her and that she had practiced for more than 20 years. She was a butcher, trained in the art of slaughtering livestock and processing the meat that resulted, expert in the use of the knives and cleavers and saws that the work required. Her father had wanted sons but had received only daughters, had taught Dovie the trade anyway, because the work needed doing and she had shown an aptitude that her sisters lacked. The training had begun when Dovie was 12 years old, her father placing a knife in her hand and guiding her through the cuts that would separate a hog into its component parts. The work was not for the squeamish, required a willingness to inflict damage that most people could not sustain, demanded a steadiness of hand and mind that not everyone possessed. Dovie had taken to it naturally, had shown from the beginning an ability to remain calm while blood flowed and bodies came apart, had developed skills that her father eventually acknowledged exceeded his own. The butchering process required knowledge of anatomy that went beyond what ordinary education provided. Dovie learned where every major blood vessel ran in a hog's body, where the joints connected that had to be severed to remove limbs, where the organs lay that had to be extracted without rupturing. She learned how to kill quickly and cleanly, how to bleed a carcass efficiently, how to break down a body into cuts that could be preserved or sold. The knowledge accumulated over 2 decades of practice, becoming instinct rather than conscious thought. Her tools were extensions of her hands, implements she had used so often that they felt like natural parts of her body. The skinning knife with its curved blade that could separate hide from flesh with minimal waste. The boning knife whose flexibility allowed it to follow contours that rigid blades could not navigate. the cleaver whose weight could sever bones that no knife could cut, the meat saw that could divide carcasses along lines that cleaver work could not achieve cleanly. Each tool had its purpose, and Dovie knew when to use each one. The butchering work had given Dovie knowledge that few women possessed, an understanding of anatomy that extended beyond the animals she processed to the human bodies that were not so different in their fundamental construction. She knew where the major blood vessels ran, knew how to sever them quickly and cleanly, knew how to break down a carcass into its component parts with an efficiency that came from decades of practice. The skills she had developed for processing hogs and cattle could be applied to other purposes, as the men who had taken her son would eventually discover. Her household in 1914 consisted of herself and the 5 children who had survived their infancy, ranging from her oldest daughter at 18 to her youngest son at 10. The youngest, a boy named Samuel, was the child who held her heart most completely, the baby who had been born shortly before his father's death, and who had become the focus of all the love she might have given to her husband. Samuel was a bright boy, curious and kind, helpful in ways that went beyond what a 10-year-old might be expected to contribute, possessed of a gentleness that seemed almost out of place in the hard world of the Kentucky mountains. Samuel helped his mother with the butchering work, had begun learning the trade that she had learned from her father, assisted with tasks that his small hands could manage, while she performed the heavier work that required adult strength. He showed aptitude for the craft, the same natural understanding of anatomy that had made Dovie exceptional, the same steady hands that the precise work required. She had begun teaching him the techniques that her father had taught her, passing on knowledge that connected the past to the future. The conflict that would lead to tragedy was rooted in a feud that had begun before Dovie was born, a dispute between the Branham family and a clan called the Crawfords that had claimed lives across 3 generations. The origins of the feud were lost in competing accounts that each family told differently, but its continuation required no origin, the accumulated grievances of decades providing justification enough for violence that fed upon itself. Dovie had tried to stay neutral in the feud, had raised her children to avoid the conflicts that had killed so many of their relatives, had hoped that her family might escape the curse that seemed to hang over both clans. The Crawfords, however, had not forgotten that Dovie was a Branham by marriage and that her children carried the Branham name. The death of Vernon Crawford in the summer of 1914, killed by a distant Branham cousin in circumstances that remained disputed, had reignited passions that had briefly subsided. The Crawford patriarch, a man named Elijah Crawford, had sworn vengeance against every Branham he could reach, had gathered his sons and nephews and the hired men who served his interests, had begun a campaign of violence that would eventually touch Dovie's family, despite her efforts to remain apart. The 18 men who would become the focus of our story were the core of Elijah Crawford's enforcement apparatus, the fighters who carried out the violence that the patriarch directed. They were young men mostly, in their 20s and 30s, hardened by lives that had known little except conflict, loyal to Elijah Crawford through bonds of blood and money and shared hatred. They had killed before, had burned homes and destroyed property, and inflicted terror on families whose only crime was bearing the wrong name or being connected to the wrong side of a dispute they had not chosen. The kidnapping of Samuel Branham occurred on the morning of October 15, 1914, while the boy was walking to the schoolhouse that served the Hollows children. The men had been watching the Branham property for days, had learned the family's routines, had identified Samuel as the most vulnerable target and the one whose loss would cause the greatest pain. They intercepted him on the trail, seized him before he could cry out, carried him into the forest where no one would hear his screams. Dovie discovered her son's disappearance when he failed to return from school that afternoon. The delay initially attributed to the wandering that boys sometimes did, the extended play with friends that made them late for dinner. But as the hours passed and darkness fell, she understood that something was wrong, organized a search that found nothing except the scattered contents of Samuel's school bag, at a point along the trail where the signs of struggle could still be read. The message from the Crawfords came the following morning, delivered by a man who had been paid to carry it, but who had no direct involvement in the kidnapping. The message was simple and devastating. Samuel Branham had been taken as payment for Vernon Crawford's death, and he would be returned only when the Branhams responsible for that death had been delivered to the Crawford family for punishment. If the demands were not met within 1 week, Samuel would die. Dovie understood immediately that the demands were impossible to meet. The Branham cousin who had killed Vernon Crawford had fled the state and could not be found. Even if he could be located, Dovie had no authority to deliver him to anyone, no ability to compel cooperation from relatives who had their own interests and their own feuds to pursue. The message was not a genuine offer of negotiation, but was a death sentence for her son, the week's delay serving only to maximize the suffering that the Crawfords wished to inflict. She tried everything she could imagine to save Samuel through legitimate means. She appealed to the sheriff, who expressed sympathy, but explained that he could not intervene in feud matters without risking his own life and the lives of his deputies. She sought help from the Branham elders, who offered condolences, but explained that they could not surrender a man to certain death even to save a child. She even attempted to approach the Crawfords directly, to offer herself in exchange for her son, but was turned away by men whose hatred extended to anyone who bore the Branham name. The week passed with agonizing slowness, each day bringing Dovie closer to a deadline she could not prevent from arriving. She spent the time in a state that alternated between desperate action and paralyzed grief, searching for solutions that did not exist, praying for miracles that did not come. Her older children tried to comfort her, tried to maintain hope that something would change, but the hollowness in their eyes told her that they understood what she understood. Samuel was going to die because she could not save him. The Crawfords' message on the 8th day confirmed what she had feared. Samuel was dead, had been thrown into an abandoned mine shaft that the Crawfords used for disposing of problems they wanted to disappear, his body beyond recovery in the darkness and the depth where they had deposited it. The message provided details that were designed to torment, descriptions of Samuel's fear and his pleas for his mother, accounts of his final moments that Dovie would never be able to banish from her memory. The messenger, paid to deliver words he did not write, read from a paper that the Crawfords had prepared. "Your boy called for you at the end. He called and called for his mama while we carried him to the shaft. He promised to be good if we would let him go home. He said his mama would be worried about him. We told him his mama couldn't help him, that nobody could help him, that he was going in the hole and there was nothing anyone could do about it." The message continued with details that suggested the Crawfords had taken pleasure in the boy's terror. "He screamed when we held him over the edge. He grabbed at our arms, tried to hold on, but he's just a little thing and we're grown men. We dropped him and listened to him fall. He screamed all the way down. Then there was a sound when he hit the bottom and then nothing. Your boy is gone. Branham woman. Gone where nobody will ever find him. Gone where the rats and the water will take care of what's left." The message concluded with a warning that Dovie would disregard. "Don't think about revenge. We've killed plenty of people who tried to take revenge on Crawfords. We'll kill you and the rest of your children if you try anything. Accept what happened and move on, or we'll put the rest of your family in that same hole." The men who delivered this message did not understand that they were sealing their own fates. They saw only a grief-stricken mother, a small woman whose world had just been destroyed, a figure too broken by loss to pose any threat to men who had killed many times before. They did not see the transformation that was already beginning behind Dovie's eyes, the grief that was converting into something colder and more purposeful, the mother's love that was becoming a mother's fury. Samuel's body was never recovered from the mine shaft, was never given proper burial, was never laid to rest beside his father in the church cemetery. This denial of closure added a dimension to Dovie's grief that made it impossible to process through normal means. The absence of a grave meaning, the absence of any ritual that might have begun the healing that loss requires. She held a funeral anyway, a service for an empty coffin that the community attended in numbers that surprised her, neighbors and relatives coming to mourn a boy whose death represented everything that was wrong with the feuds that plagued their land. The planning began during that service, though Dovie gave no outward sign of what she was preparing. She knew the names of the 18 men who had participated in Samuel's kidnapping and death, had extracted the information through the network of relationships that connected every family in the mountains, had identified each one through careful inquiry that revealed nothing of her purpose. She knew that they had killed her son for the crime of bearing the wrong name, and she knew that she would kill each of them for the crime of killing him. The method she chose reflected the skills that a lifetime of butchering had provided. She would not shoot the men, would not poison them, would not employ any of the indirect methods that other avengers had used. She would butcher them, as she had butchered countless hogs and cattle, would use the knives and cleavers that she had mastered over 20 years, would apply to human bodies the techniques she had developed for processing animal carcasses. The killing would be personal and physical, would require her to feel the blood on her hands, would achieve an intimacy of vengeance that other methods could not match. The preparation of her weapons occupied the days following the funeral. She sharpened her butchering knives to edges that could slice through flesh with minimal pressure, honed her cleaver until it could sever bone with a single blow, assembled the tools that would transform her from butcher of livestock to butcher of men. The weapons were not exotic or difficult to obtain, were simply the implements of her trade, were distinguished only by the purpose to which they would now be applied. The first killing came 3 weeks after Samuel's death, on the night of November 8, 1914. The target was a man named Dale Tackett, one of the Crawford enforcers who had participated in the kidnapping, a man whose boasting about what he had done to the Branham boy had reached Dovie's ears through informants who did not know why she was asking. Tackett had been drinking at a roadhouse that served the Crawford faction, had left alone and intoxicated, had taken a path through the woods that Dovie knew he would take. She intercepted him in the darkness, a small figure emerging from shadows that Tackett's alcohol-clouded vision did not penetrate until she was upon him. The knife entered his body before he could react, the blade severing the femoral artery that her butcher's knowledge told her would produce the fastest bleed-out. The cut was precise, delivered with the same economy of motion that characterized all her butchering work, efficient and professional despite the circumstances. Tackett collapsed, his blood pumping out onto the forest floor in spurts that matched his heartbeat, each pulse sending another surge of crimson onto the leaves beneath him. He tried to stand, tried to run, tried to apply pressure to a wound that his hands could not find in the darkness. The blood kept coming, his strength draining with every heartbeat, his body understanding before his mind did that he was dying. Dovie stood over him, watching his struggles with the professional detachment that her butchering work had cultivated. She had seen countless animals die, had observed the process with the attention that her craft required, had learned to read the signs that indicated how close death was and how much suffering remained. Tackett's struggles were weakening, his movements becoming uncoordinated, his attempts at speech producing only gurgles that conveyed nothing. "This is for Samuel," she said, the words soft but carrying clearly in the silence of the forest. "Remember his name. You'll be explaining to God why you killed him soon enough." Tackett's eyes met hers, recognition finally arriving as his brain processed what his senses were telling him. This was the Branham woman, the mother of the boy they had thrown in the mine shaft, the woman whose grief they had mocked in the messages they had sent. The woman was killing him, had already killed him with a single cut that he never saw coming, was watching him die with an expression that showed no more emotion than she might have shown while watching a hog bleed out. "Please," he managed to say, the word barely audible through the blood that was filling his throat. "Please, But Dovie was not interested in his pleas. She had heard Samuel's pleas described in the message the Crawfords had sent, had imagined her son begging for mercy from men who had none to give. Tackett had shown no mercy to Samuel, and she would show no mercy to Tackett. Tackett died within minutes, his body growing cold on the forest floor while Dovie watched. She felt nothing that she would describe as satisfaction, only a completion of a task that had to be done, a step taken on a journey that had 17 more steps remaining. She left the body where it lay, made no attempt to conceal the killing, wanted the Crawfords to know that someone was hunting their men. The discovery of Tackett's body the following day sent tremors through the Crawford organization, the manner of death making clear that this was not an ordinary killing. The wound was precise, the cut made by someone who understood anatomy, the method suggesting expertise that few people in the mountains possessed. The connection to Samuel Branham's death was obvious, but the idea that a small woman might have killed one of their hardened fighters seemed impossible to the Crawford men. The second killing came 4 days later. Another of the 18 men who had participated in Samuel's kidnapping, Another body found in circumstances that made clear the same person was responsible. This victim, Robert Lawson, had been killed with a cleaver rather than a knife, his skull split by a single blow that only someone with significant strength and precision could have delivered. The weapon had been wielded from behind, the victim unaware of the danger until the moment of impact. The killing efficient and personal. That's right. Dovie continued her campaign through the autumn of 1914 and into the winter that followed, claiming victims with a regularity that reflected her patience and her skill. The third killing came a week after the second, the fourth 2 days after that, the pace accelerating as Dovie grew more confident in her methods and as the pool of potential victims grew more fearful and therefore more careless. Each killing bore the same signature: precise wounds, butchering expertise, a violence that was methodical rather than frenzied. The Crawford organization responded to the killings with measures that should have made further attacks impossible. The remaining targets traveled in groups, armed themselves at all times, varied their routines in ways designed to prevent ambush. Elijah Crawford brought in additional men to protect his fighters, hired guards who were supposed to prevent exactly the kind of attacks that were decimating his force. The measures proved inadequate against an enemy who knew the terrain better than any outsider and who had patience that exceeded any security protocol. The fifth and sixth killings came within a single week, both victims found in locations where they should have been safe, both displaying wounds that reflected Dovie's butchering expertise. One had been killed in his own barn, his body found hanging from a meat hook, in a position that suggested he had been processed like the livestock that normally hung there. The other had been killed in the outhouse behind his cabin, a location so humble and so private that no one had thought to include it in the security measures. The seventh killing was particularly brutal, the victim having been one of those who had provided the detailed descriptions of Samuel's death, the man who had boasted about dropping the boy into the shaft and listening to his screams. His body was processed, as Dovie might have processed a hog, dismembered and arranged in patterns that communicated a message the Crawfords could not fail to understand. The head was placed facing the Crawford compound, the eyes left open, the expression on the face frozen in the terror of his final moments. The dismemberment had been professional, the cuts following the same lines that Dovie would have used on an animal carcass. Limbs were removed at the joints, the cuts clean and precise, no evidence of sawing or hacking that might have suggested amateur work. The organs had been removed and arranged beside the body, the heart placed prominently as though to suggest that this was what the man had coming for his heartlessness toward Samuel. The message was clear. The Crawfords had treated Samuel as less than human, and Dovie was treating their men as less than human in return. The 8th, 9th, and 10th killings came in rapid succession, Dovie's campaign reaching a pace that the Crawford organization could not sustain. The men who had participated in Samuel's kidnapping began to flee, some leaving the county entirely, others hiding in locations they believed Dovie could not reach. Their flight only delayed their fates. Dovie tracked them with a patience that reflected her understanding that vengeance required no deadline, that each man could be reached eventually regardless of where he tried to hide. The 11th killing occurred in Virginia, where one of the Crawford men had fled seeking safety. Dovie traveled across state lines, located her target through family connections that extended throughout the Appalachian region, killed him in the same manner she had killed the others. The body was found 3 days later, the same precise wounds, the same evidence of butchering expertise, the same message that distance provided no protection against a mother's fury. The 12th and 13th killings came in quick succession after Dovie's return to Harlan County, her absence having made the remaining targets believe they might be safe in familiar territory. They were wrong. The killings continued with the same regularity they had always shown, each victim dying in circumstances that demonstrated Dovie's ability to reach anyone she targeted, each death adding to the toll that was destroying the Crawford organization. The 14th killing marked a turning point in the campaign. The victim was Elijah Crawford's oldest son, Thomas, a man who had personally participated in throwing Samuel into the mine shaft and who had been one of those providing the taunting descriptions of the boy's final moments. Thomas Crawford had surrounded himself with protection that should have been impenetrable, had never traveled alone, had kept armed guards within calling distance at all times. Dovie reached him anyway. The killing occurred in Thomas's own home, in the bedroom where he slept beside his wife, in circumstances that made clear that no security could protect against an enemy who was willing to take any risk to achieve her purpose. Thomas's wife woke to find her husband dead beside her, his throat cut so cleanly that he had never made a sound, the sheets soaked with blood that had pumped out while she slept unaware. The wife herself was unharmed, a choice that communicated Dovie's discipline even in the midst of violence that knew no other limits. Elijah Crawford received his son's death as the message it was intended to be, an announcement that the killings would continue until every man responsible for Samuel's death had paid with his own life. The old patriarch responded by increasing the price on Dovie's head, by offering rewards that attracted bounty hunters from throughout the region, by deploying resources that should have been sufficient to locate and kill a single woman operating alone. The hunters became the hunted. 3 of the bounty hunters who sought the price on Dovie's head were themselves killed, their bodies found with the same wounds that characterized all of her victims, their fates serving as warnings to others who might consider pursuing her. The hunters who survived abandoned their pursuit, concluding that no reward was worth the risk of becoming another victim of the Kentucky Reaper. The 15th, 16th, and 17th killings came in the early months of 1915, reducing the number of surviving participants in Samuel's kidnapping to just 2. A Crawford nephew named William who had gone into hiding so deep that even Dovie's informants could not locate him, and Elijah Crawford himself, the patriarch whose orders had set the kidnapping in motion. William Crawford emerged from hiding in March of 1915, apparently believing that enough time had passed for the danger to have subsided. He was wrong. Dovie killed him within a week of his reappearance, the body found in circumstances that echoed all the previous killings, the same precise wounds, the same evidence of butchering expertise, the same message that hiding only delayed the inevitable. And then there was only Elijah Crawford, the man who had ordered Samuel's kidnapping, who had decreed the boy's death when the impossible demands were not met, who bore ultimate responsibility for everything that had followed. The old patriarch knew that he was the final target, understood that Dovie would never stop until he had joined the 17 men who had preceded him. He fortified his home, surrounded himself with guards, took every precaution that his considerable resources could provide. The final killing came on the night of April 15, 1915, exactly 6 months after Samuel's kidnapping. Dovie approached the Crawford compound alone, navigated security that should have been impenetrable, reached the bedroom where Elijah Crawford slept, surrounded by guards who were supposed to prevent exactly this scenario. The guards died first, killed silently in the darkness, their throats cut before they could raise alarm. Then Dovie entered the room where the patriarch slept. She woke him before she killed him, wanted him to know who had come for him and why, wanted his last moments to be spent in the knowledge that everything he had built was being destroyed by a woman he had underestimated. "You took my son," she said, her voice soft but carrying clearly in the darkness. "You threw him in a hole and left him to die alone in the dark. For 6 months I have been killing your men, and now I am killing you. Remember Samuel's name. You'll be explaining to God why you murdered him very soon." Elijah Crawford tried to respond, tried to call for guards who could no longer answer, tried to reach weapons that Dovie had already removed from his bedside. It did not matter. The cleaver that had killed so many of his men now killed him, a single blow that split his skull and ended a life that had caused so much suffering. Dovie walked out of the Crawford compound the same way she had entered, passing through security that had failed at every level, disappearing into the night before anyone discovered what had happened. The bodies of Elijah Crawford and his guards were found the following morning, the manner of death making clear that the Kentucky Reaper had completed her work, that every man responsible for Samuel Branham's kidnapping and death had now paid with his own life. The investigation that followed was the most extensive in the history of law enforcement in Harlan County. 18 men had been killed over 6 months, all by the same perpetrator, all connected to a single kidnapping that had claimed the life of a 10-year-old boy. The evidence pointed overwhelmingly toward Dovie Branham, the mother of the murdered child, a woman whose butchering skills matched the wounds found on every victim. Dovie was arrested, of course, the evidence against her too overwhelming to ignore. She offered no denial, made no attempt to conceal what she had done, seemed almost proud of the vengeance she had achieved. When asked by investigators why she had killed 18 men, her response was simple and direct. "They took my boy. They threw him in a hole and left him to die calling for his mama." What would you do? The trial that followed was one of the most remarkable in Kentucky legal history. The prosecution presented evidence that documented each of the 18 killings, established Dovie's method and her motive, built a case that should have been impossible to defeat. Witness after witness testified to the wounds found on the victims, to the butchering expertise they displayed, to the statements Dovie had made to investigators about why she had done what she had done. The prosecutor was a man named William Howard, appointed specially by the state, because the local prosecutor had recused himself, citing family connections to both the Branhams and the Crawfords that made impartiality impossible. Howard was from Lexington, had no connection to the mountain feuds, approached the case as a straightforward matter of law enforcement. He could not understand why the jury was not responding to evidence that seemed overwhelming. The defense, led by a local attorney named Thomas Combs, who was himself distantly related to Dovie, presented evidence of Samuel's kidnapping and murder, called witnesses who testified to the Crawford family's history of violence, painted a picture of a mother who had been given no choice except to seek justice through means the legal system could not provide. The defense called neighbors who had heard the Crawfords boasting about what they had done to Samuel, who testified to the terror that the Crawford organization had imposed on the community for decades, who described their own losses at the hands of men who now lay dead by Dovie's hand. The defense called the messenger, who had delivered the Crawfords' taunting letter, who repeated the words that had described Samuel's final moments, who watched the jury's faces harden as they understood what had been done to a 10-year-old boy. The defense called Dovie herself, who testified in a voice so soft that the spectators had to strain to hear. She described Samuel's birth, his first steps, his first words. She described teaching him to read, watching him grow, beginning to teach him the butchering trade that she had learned from her father. She described the morning he left for school and never returned, the week of desperate searching, the message that told her he was gone. When asked why she had killed 18 men, she looked directly at the jury and answered, "They took my boy. They threw him in a hole and left him to die in the dark, calling for his mama. They sent me a letter describing how he begged them to let him go home. What would any of you do? What would you do if someone did that to your child?" The jury deliberated for 6 hours before returning a verdict that would become famous throughout the Appalachian region. Not guilty on all counts. The verdict represented not a finding that Dovie had not committed the killings, but a judgment that the killings were justified, that a mother who had been denied justice through legitimate means had the right to seek it through other methods. The jury's decision was jury nullification in its purest form, the community's values overriding the law's requirements. Dovie Branham returned to her property after the trial, resumed the life that Samuel's kidnapping had interrupted, continued the butchering work that had made her capable of the vengeance she had achieved. She never remarried, never seemed to recover fully from the loss of her youngest son, carried the grief of his death until her own death 28 years later. But she also carried the knowledge that she had done what needed to be done, that every man responsible for Samuel's death had paid for their crime. She lived until 1943, dying at the age of 64 in the cabin where she had raised her children and from which she had conducted her campaign of vengeance. Her funeral was attended by hundreds of people from throughout the mountain communities, neighbors and relatives and strangers who had heard the story of the Kentucky Reaper and who came to pay respects to a woman who had become a legend. The preacher who delivered her eulogy spoke of her love for her children, her devotion to her family, her strength in the face of losses that would have broken weaker women. Her grave lies in the church cemetery beside her husband, the two of them reunited in death after the years of separation that his mining accident had imposed. The inscription on her stone gives no hint of what she did in the 6 months following Samuel's death, bearing only her name and her dates and a phrase that the community chose to remember her by: "A mother's love knows no bounds." The words acknowledge the motivation without specifying the action, a memorial that those who know the story understand and those who do not can interpret innocently. Samuel's grave is not beside hers, because Samuel has no grave. His body remains in the mineshaft where the Crawfords deposited it, beyond recovery, even if anyone knew exactly which of the dozens of abandoned shafts in the area contained his remains. Dovie erected a marker for him in the cemetery anyway, a stone that bears his name and his dates, and an inscription that speaks to those who know the story. Taken by evil, avenged by love. The marker stands beside his mother's grave, a memorial to a boy whose body could not be buried, but whose memory could not be erased. The mineshaft where Samuel died has never been identified with certainty. The Crawfords who knew its location all died in Dovie's campaign, taking the knowledge with them to their own graves. Searchers over the decades have explored numerous shafts without finding the remains, the region's geography and mining history creating dozens of possible locations that cannot all be investigated. Samuel remains lost, his final resting place unknown, a ghost whose absence haunts the story as much as any presence could. The legal aftermath of the case was significant despite the acquittal. The killing of 18 men in a systematic campaign of vengeance prompted discussions throughout Kentucky about the relationship between law and justice, about the rights of citizens when the legal system failed to protect them, about the limits of violence that could be considered acceptable in response to violence. The case became a reference point in debates about self-help justice, cited by those who argued that the law's failure created space for individual action. The broader impact of the case extended beyond the specific debates it prompted. The story of the Kentucky Reaper became a cautionary tale about the consequences of targeting children in feud violence, a reminder that mothers possessed capabilities for vengeance that exceeded anything men might imagine. The feuding families of eastern Kentucky became more careful about involving children in their conflicts, the memory of what Dovie Branham had done serving as a deterrent that no legal punishment could have provided. The title Kentucky Reaper emerged naturally from the community's response to the killings, the agricultural metaphor capturing something essential about what Dovie had done. She had harvested the men who had killed her son, had cut them down as she might have cut wheat or corn, had processed them through the same skills she had used to process livestock. The title acknowledged her butchering expertise, while also suggesting something almost supernatural about her ability to reach victims who should have been unreachable. The songs that emerged from the Kentucky Reaper story were among the most powerful in the Appalachian tradition, their subject matter requiring melodies and lyrics that captured the savage intensity of a mother's vengeance. The most popular ballad told the story from beginning to end, from the kidnapping and Samuel's death through the 18 killings that had followed, its verses painting a portrait of love transformed into fury. The first verse described Dovie as she had been before the tragedy, a widow raising her children alone, a butcher whose skills had supported her family since her husband's death, a mother whose love for her youngest son had been the center of her existence. The melody was almost tender, suggesting the ordinary life that was about to be destroyed by extraordinary violence. The second verse described Samuel, the 10-year-old boy who had been learning his mother's trade, whose brightness and kindness had made him beloved throughout the hollow, whose death would transform everything. The melody became more tender still, the notes carrying the affection of a mother for a child who would soon be lost. The third verse described the kidnapping, the men seizing Samuel on his way to school, the impossible demands that were designed to ensure his death, the mineshaft where they threw him while he called for his mother. This verse was devastating, its melody dropping into minor keys that suggested depths of cruelty that words alone could not capture. The fourth verse described Dovie's transformation, grief becoming fury, helplessness becoming determination, a mother's love becoming a mother's vengeance. The melody shifted here, becoming darker and more deliberate, suggesting something ancient awakening, something that would not rest until it had achieved its purpose. The fifth verse described the killings themselves, the 18 men falling one by one, the butcher's knives doing to human bodies what they had always done to animal bodies, the blood that flowed as each victim paid for Samuel's death. The melody had a relentless quality here, the rhythm suggesting the steady pace of harvesting, the systematic completion of work that had to be done. The sixth verse described the community's response, the fear that spread through the Crawford organization, the flight of men who tried to escape, the futility of every precaution against a woman who could not be stopped. The melody became almost triumphant here, suggesting that justice was being achieved despite every obstacle. The seventh verse described the final killing, Elijah Crawford dying in his own bed, the patriarch who had ordered Samuel's death meeting his end at the hands of the mother he had wronged. The melody reached a climax here, the notes suggesting completion and resolution. The final verse described the trial and the acquittal, the community's verdict that Dovie had done what justice required, her return to the life that would never be complete without her son. The melody resolved into something approaching peace, though a peace that carried the weight of everything that had been lost. Musicians who performed this ballad reported that audiences responded with an intensity that exceeded their responses to other songs in the tradition. There was horror at the violence Dovie had committed, the butchering of 18 men disturbing even to those who believed her cause was just. But there was also admiration for her skill and her determination, recognition that she had achieved something that seemed impossible, that she had destroyed an entire organization through her own efforts alone. Another song focused specifically on the butchering method, describing in detail the wounds that Dovie had inflicted, the expertise that the killings had demonstrated, the knowledge of anatomy that had made her so effective. This song was darker than the main ballad, its verses almost clinical in their descriptions, its melody suggesting the professional detachment that allowed Dovie to do what had to be done. A third song told the story from Samuel's perspective, imagining his final moments in the mineshaft, the darkness and the fear and the calling for a mother who could not hear him. This song was the most painful of all, its melody barely audible, its lyrics creating images that listeners found difficult to bear. A fourth song addressed the question of justice, examining whether 18 deaths could balance one death, whether the butchering method was more or less acceptable than other forms of killing, whether Dovie had achieved something noble or something monstrous. This song offered no answers, only questions that listeners were invited to consider. A fifth song celebrated the jury's verdict, the community's refusal to convict a mother whose cause they believed was just, the triumph of mountain justice over formal law. This song had a defiant quality, its melody suggesting pride in the community's values and its willingness to express them through the jury system. The historians who have studied the Kentucky Reaper case have reached varying conclusions about its significance and meaning. Some have analyzed it as an example of self-help justice in a region where formal law enforcement was inadequate, arguing that Dovie's actions reflected the mountain community's understanding that violence was sometimes necessary when legitimate systems failed. The kidnapping and murder of Samuel Branham had received no response from legal authorities, and Dovie's campaign reflected her recognition that she alone could provide the justice her son deserved. Others have focused on the gender dynamics of the case, examining how Dovie's success challenged assumptions about women's capacity for violence. The expectation that a small woman could not threaten hardened fighters had allowed her to achieve surprise in many of her killings, the assumptions about feminine weakness becoming tools that she used against her targets. Her success demonstrated that physical size was less important than skill and determination in achieving violent purposes. The medical analysis has examined the butchering method, noting that the wounds found on Dovie's victims reflected genuine expertise in anatomy and in the use of cutting tools. The efficiency of her killings, the precision of her cuts, the ability to inflict fatal damage with minimal struggle, all suggested training that went beyond what amateur violence could achieve. Her father's decision to teach her butchering had created capabilities that he could never have imagined being applied to such purposes. The psychological analysis has examined Dovie's state of mind, noting that the transformation from grieving mother to methodical killer required a psychological shift that most people could not have achieved. She had maintained her campaign for 6 months, had killed 18 men without apparent hesitation or remorse, had displayed a capacity for sustained violence that suggested either exceptional mental discipline or a break from ordinary emotional processing that might itself be considered a form of damage. The sociological analysis has examined the community's role in protecting Dovie, noting that her success depended on an information network that provided intelligence about her targets while concealing her own movements. The informants who told her where to find her victims, the families who provided shelter when she needed it, the jury that ultimately acquitted her, all reflected a community consensus that her cause was just and that she deserved support. The feud analysis has examined the case's impact on the broader pattern of violence in Harlan County, noting that Dovie's campaign effectively destroyed the Crawford organization and shifted the balance of power among the feuding families. The removal of 18 fighters, including the patriarch and his oldest son, left the Crawfords unable to continue their conflict with the Branhams or anyone else. The feud that had claimed lives for generations effectively ended with Dovie's campaign. The cost of continuation demonstrated to be higher than any faction was willing to pay. You see, what Dovie Branham did cannot be justified by any conventional legal or moral framework. She killed 18 men with butcher's tools, conducted a campaign of violence that lasted 6 months, employed methods that were designed to inflict maximum damage on human bodies. The fact that her victims had participated in her son's kidnapping and death does not eliminate the fact that she took 18 human lives in response to one. And yet her story cannot be simply condemned, reduced to a tale of murder that teaches only the obvious lesson that killing is wrong. Her son had been kidnapped by men who made demands they knew could not be met, had been thrown into a mine shaft and left to die in darkness, calling for a mother who could not reach him, had been murdered by men who faced no consequences, from a legal system that would not intervene in feud matters. The system that was supposed to protect Samuel had failed completely, had made clear through its refusal to act that the lives of children caught in feud violence meant nothing when weighed against the risks of intervention. The butchering method that Dovie employed adds a dimension to this story that distinguishes it from other tales of vengeance. She did not merely kill her targets, but processed them as she would have processed livestock, applied professional skills to the destruction of human bodies, achieved an efficiency that reflected decades of practice. The method was both practical, her butchering skills being the capabilities she had available, and symbolic, the treatment of her victims as meat, communicating a message about their value as human beings. The question of whether her response was proportionate is one that the jury answered in her favor, but that subsequent generations have continued to debate. 18 men died in response to one child's death, the ratio seeming disproportionate by any numerical standard. But the jury that heard the full story of Samuel's kidnapping and murder, that understood what had been done to a 10-year-old boy, and the mother who had been denied any legitimate means of response, concluded that the 18 deaths were justified. Their verdict represented not merely an acquittal, but a judgment about the relative guilt of perpetrator and victims. The descendants of Dovie Branham still live in the mountains of eastern Kentucky, carrying memories passed down through generations about what their ancestor did and why. Family stories speak of Dovie with a mixture of reverence and unease, acknowledging both the love that had driven her and the violence she had committed. She is remembered as proof that mothers should never be underestimated, that the skills developed for peaceful purposes can be applied to violent ones, that grief can transform into fury, that nothing can stop. The marker for Samuel that stands in the church cemetery is maintained by descendants who never knew him, but who understand his significance in the family's history. The marker represents an absence rather than a presence, a memorial to a boy whose body was never recovered, whose final resting place remains unknown, whose death had consequences that shaped the region's history for generations. The story of the Kentucky Reaper endures because it speaks to something fundamental in the human experience. It is the story of a mother's love that exceeded all boundaries, that transformed into something terrible when that love was violated, that achieved vengeance through methods that no one had anticipated. It is the story of skills applied to unexpected purposes, of butchering knowledge turned from livestock to human targets, of professional expertise becoming the instrument of personal vengeance. What about you, my friend? Would you make that journey to stand at Dovie's grave, to read the inscription that promises a mother's love knows no bounds, to contemplate the life of a woman who butchered 18 men with the same tools she had used to process hogs? Would you seek out the marker for Samuel, the memorial to a boy whose body was never found? Would you wonder which of the region's countless abandoned shafts holds his remains? The journey to Harlan County is easier now than it was in 1914, the roads paved and the connections to the outside world more numerous than they were when Dovie Branham butchered 18 men who had kidnapped her son. But the mountains remain, ancient and patient, holding their memories close like they hold the morning mist and the evening shadows. The graves of mothers and the markers for lost children rest in those mountains, their stories intertwined in ways that refuse to be untangled. The mountains keep their secrets, but not this one. The story of the Kentucky Reaper has been told and retold through generations, passed from parent to child, sung in ballads that still bring shivers to those who hear them. It is a story about what happens when men kill a child and believe they will escape consequences, when a mother discovers capabilities she never knew she had, when the tools of a peaceful trade become the instruments of vengeance. It is a story that forces us to ask uncomfortable questions about love and violence, about skills and their applications, about what we would do if someone threw our child in a hole and left them to die in the darkness. And that, my friend, is the true story of the Kentucky Reaper, who butchered 18 men with the same skills she had used to butcher livestock, who killed every participant in her son's kidnapping and murder, who was tried and acquitted by a jury that believed her cause was just. A story of a mother's love and a mother's fury, of knives and cleavers applied to purposes their makers never intended, of a 10-year-old boy whose body was never found, but whose death was avenged with a thoroughness that became legend. The mountains remember, and through them, so do we all.